Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of For the Reestablishment of Our Marxist Vanguard by John Williamson from 1945. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this is the next installment in the anti-Browderism or first wave U.S. anti-revisionism playlist, which is named after Earl Browder, the one-time General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, CPUSA, who at one time was a good Marxist, and we showed that earlier in the playlist. Then in the 1940s, he took an extreme revisionist turn. Now, for newcomers, if you haven't listened to the earlier parts of the playlist, I highly recommend going back and doing that. There's a link in the video description. But when we talk about revisionism in a Marxist context, what do we mean? Well, revisionism in this sense is the substitution of proletarian ideas with capitalist ones. So basically, it is when capitalist ideas start to infiltrate and permeate the communist vanguard itself. You know, living in an advanced capitalist or imperialist society, bourgeois or capitalist influence is all around us. They spend billions of dollars a week on the media trying to basically get capitalist ideology everywhere, where it's just unquestioned and part of the basic assumptions of how people think about their lives and analyze social situations. Of course, the communist vanguard is representing the advanced detachment of proletarian thought and trying to represent the proletariat in the class struggle and advise it. And this is where Marxism comes in as a set of analytical tools for doing that in an anti-capitalist way. And we have to maintain that class independence. If you allow capitalist thinking to start to infiltrate your movement, you're going to fall prey to things like reformism and anti-revolutionary thought. And ultimately, that is enough to kill a movement. It doesn't actually take that much. And by the way, when we talk about reformism, we're talking about mere reformism. Any Marxist revolutionary will be for reforms in the proper context and at the proper timing. You know, which particular reforms advance the movement at a particular time is a matter of debate, but we are open to reforms in principle. There's a lot of people who say that, no, any reform is always bad, it lowers consciousness and things like, no, that's not true. So reforms can be useful in particular contexts, but when you limit the struggle to seeking reforms under capitalism, that is falling prey to bourgeois thought and reformism. Capitalism cannot be reformed on a permanent basis, and the capitalist class cannot be made to give up its power without revolution. So anyway, CPUSA back in the 40s had been doing pretty good, and then they started just veering wildly off course with this right deviationist, opportunist error, talking about peaceful collaboration between the USA and the USSR, in many ways foreshadowing what was to come within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself in the later 50s and 60s under Khrushchev, with Khrushchevite or modern revisionism. These were major deviations from Marxism-Leninism, which arguably laid the grounds for the eventual demise of the USSR. Just a few decades later, they arguably never recovered. So anyway, coming back to John Williamson and For the Reestablishment of Our Marxist Vanguard from June 18 to 20, 1945, these were extracts from a report to a meeting of the CPA National Committee. So what's the CPA? Well, this is where, under Browder, the CPUSA liquidated itself and created this communist political association in its place. The reasoning provided for this was terrible, and so one of the criticisms of the official anti-Browderist, quote-unquote, restoration of CPUSA around this time is that a lot of the people who, quote-unquote, restored the party were the very same who had just a couple of years prior been enthusiastically voting to liquidate it. So, you know, which position did they truly hold? And later in this playlist, in segment 3, which we haven't started yet, we're going to get into criticism of the official anti-Browderists, such as Williamson and others. Because if we go back to a piece that we did earlier in the playlist, Shall the Communist Party Change Its Name? From about a year and a half prior, January 1944, John Williamson was in there alongside of Browder saying the following, quote, "As a consequence of Tehran," this was an agreement between the UK, the US, and the USSR to fight in World War II, and the perspectives agreed upon for the period of post-war reconstruction, one of the conclusions recommended in Comrade Browder's report is the change of the term party in the title of our organization to association. This conclusion is very important to our relations with all the other forces of the Win the War coalition, and he goes on to say that this will help cement our relations politically and organizationally with hundreds of thousands of Americans. So he was right there in the top chorus singing the praises of the strategy. So now he's turning around, and what we found so far in this collection, which is called Marxism-Leninism versus Revisionism, basically phase 2 of the playlist, is these official anti-Browderists, and it's pretty tepid, it's pretty lukewarm. It's not necessarily that credible, but let's get into it. In the main reports and discussion, we established the approach, both politically and organizationally, to all the problems to be raised here. My effort will be to draw certain lessons from our recent experiences, to indicate the direction of solving some of the problems connected with the functioning of the CPA as a Marxist political party of the working class. We do not come with finalized or last word proposals. It is up to this national committee to discuss these problems seriously. Let us review briefly some expressions of this liquidationism. Firstly, on the role of the CPA in relation to the Democratic Coalition. While we conducted a struggle to achieve clarity and understanding as to the indispensability of the CPA, its role and effectiveness as an organized force in stimulating and leading mass movements, and strongly argued against those who wished to limit the organization only to educational activity, the fact remains that in both theory and practice, we tended to minimize the independent Marxist vanguard role of our organization. Comment here, it's important to remember that Marxism-Leninism stresses that there are both subjective and objective factors in making a revolution. And having a party which is providing good leadership is one of those. Lenin argued this clearly back in the early 1900s, and it was a settled question by the 1940s. Continuing. Predicating our thinking on the premise of an identity of interests between ourselves and all class forces represented in the war coalition for a long time to come, we circumscribed the function of our organization to the limits of this coalition. We negated a basic Marxist concept, fundamental to the existence of a working class Marxist party, that we must at all times maintain an independent position aimed at influencing in the first place the most decisive force within the nation, the working class, while vigilantly criticizing and overcoming hesitations and vacillations within the camp of our allies. Too often our position was determined by the concept that, quote, we must not and cannot do anything to endanger the coalition, unquote. This was falsely interpreted to mean that criticism of errors and mistakes of the Roosevelt administration and the sections of the bourgeoisie which supported the defeat of Hitler Germany would weaken the coalition. We tended to submerge our identity in the general democratic movement instead of firmly maintaining the independent position of the communists and labor as a precondition for strengthening, not weakening, national unity. Comment. Nice of you to say this now, but this is fundamental. Any time that there is a sort of national liberation struggle or anything where some kind of class collaboration is acceptable as a temporary tactic, you have to insist on the proletariat being in the lead of that coalition. Because we had seen by this point even the betrayals of social democracy and the Second International, and it was well known that you could not even rely on them, let alone the quote-unquote anti-fascist sections of the bourgeoisie. And just to clarify that, there are some sections of the bourgeoisie which are more reluctant to embrace fascist tactics to defend capitalism in times of crisis, which is basically the purpose of fascism, defending a decaying imperialism against proletarian revolution. But even in those cases, they will do anti-fascism in a bourgeois way, blocking the proletariat and doing whatever they can to block the proletarian revolution. In this sense, bourgeois anti-fascism is basically just a claim from some factions of the bourgeoisie that we can stop proletarian revolution without using fascism. In other words, it's reflective of a dispute within the capitalist class about how best to defend capitalism. Communist anti-fascism, on the other hand, is not a tactical dispute. It's against the whole system, of which fascism is an outgrowth. Anyway, continuing. Thus, we could not resolve the contradiction that constantly found expression in our organization, the contradiction between our collaboration with the democratic forces and the maintenance of our own political and organizational identity. Well, in comment to read Browder, he wasn't even trying, but, he was saying monopoly capital was progressive. I mean, that's like several orders removed, even from a slight right deviation. Continuing. During the election campaign, we called off a series of mass meetings and radio talks, stopped issuing leaflets in our own name, reached a new low in literature distribution and in our press circulation, etc. In some districts and in numerous clubs, not a single piece of literature had been prepared and issued, reacting to specific events and indicating the CPA thinking and proposed line of action to the masses for the past 6 to 9 months. We could not effectively meet and eliminate a growing underestimation of our own independent role, the absence of adequate club initiative in organizing and developing independent activities while collaborating with the democratic forces in the community. By the way, he means by democratic forces others in the Win the War coalition, so not necessarily communist elements, not necessarily even proletarian elements. Continuing. We were unable to effectively combat the trend to transform our clubs into, quote, discussion centers, instead of centers for organizing mass struggle around the key issues of the day. And we could not give a satisfactory answer to the question raised persistently within our ranks and among many workers: how does the CPA differ from other win-the-war progressive organizations? What we didn't see, namely the intimate connection of these types of problems and their political roots, the workers instinctively understood better than we. They demonstrated this by staying out of our organization in large numbers, by not giving us sustained support in local union elections and on many other occasions. Comment. So the Communist Party is supposed to be the vanguard of the working class. You're supposed to be leading them. They're not supposed to be getting ahead of you. There is really no excuse for this, and so far Williamson has not really provided a good one. It's kind of like in the last piece by Eugene Dennis, where it was like a combination of we forgot. Really, you forgot the basics of Marxism-Leninism? I don't think you did. And also things like our basic Marxism-Leninism education just wasn't good enough. Really? Why are you on the National Committee? This is in an era where, at this point, the Comintern had just recently disbanded, but you had a roaring international communist movement that was really kind of at its peak in many ways. Williamson so far has not tried to explain this. And really, I think that the only explanation is that it was deliberate. The only question then is why, but continuing. Secondly, we have seen a deterioration of the industrial and trade union composition of our membership since the CPA was organized. And sorry to break in with another comment, but we learned in an earlier reading that when this move was made, transitioning from the CPUSA to the CPA, they lost about half the membership. So yeah, this was entirely predictable. In fact, it was predictable in theory, but then after you saw just those results, where your organization got cut in half, if you were not deliberately trying to destroy the communist movement, that was your cue to back off. Continuing, we know by definition that a communist organization, to fulfill its vanguard role, quote, must absorb all the best elements of the working class, their experience, their revolutionary spirit, and their unbounded devotion to the cause of the working class. And that's a quote. Can we honestly say, despite all our positive achievements, and we don't want to detract one iota from them, that our organization embraces all the advanced workers available and ready to join? Which is key. I am not talking idealistically. The fact remains that today we only have 316 coal miners, although 10 years ago we had several times that many, or that we only have 1,427 steel workers and 840 marine workers. I could go on, with examples from other industries, states, and towns. Equally decisive as these figures, it's the fact that our ability to convince the trade union movement, including the CIO, of the correctness of our policies is far from fully established. We do not have so deep-rooted an influence or organized strength that we can influence and continue to lead decisive sections of the labor movement, irrespective of what any leader inside or outside the trade union movement may do at a critical moment. We know that workers, particularly workers in basic industries, should more readily understand our policies, our Marxist thinking. Yet, we see a weakening of our working class base in a number of key industries. During the past year, we had a decline in industrial and trade union composition for the first time in 6 years. It is clear that we should have attracted certain working class forces from key industries and industrial areas, but we did not in this period. Obviously, the CPA did not have the recruiting capacity of the Communist Party. Maybe you should have kept that. While we enrolled 63,000 Communist Party members into the CPA, or 82% of our membership, not counting those in the armed forces, and showed a growth of 25%, that was due primarily to the big recruiting campaign prior to the change of name. We had an average monthly recruiting during the first half of 1943 of 3,615 members. During 1944, 4,275. But during the first half of 1945, it dropped to 1,185. It is only fair to add that we ourselves, in line with our general policy, decided against any large-scale recruiting this year. So commenting, I just made a comment about the membership numbers. I think that the numbers in this conflict with what Foster had said. Somebody might want to check on that. But sounds to me like Williamson is putting the blame more on something that the CPA did rather than on the liquidation of the CPUSA and the establishment of the CPA. Because it sounded like from Foster's numbers, it was right at the split that the big drop happened. Continuing, it is only fair to add that we ourselves, in line with our general policy, decided against any large-scale recruiting this year. Yeah, I'd call that fair to add. Thirdly, another example was our attitude to the press. This is one mistake from which I must exclude myself and a few other members. For months, we conducted a struggle to establish the editorial concept of the Daily Worker. To some, the tabloid form was to be the cure-all answer. And comment there, tabloid has a negative connotation now. You think of the Inquirer or something. But technically, tabloid initially referred just to that form, not the sensational content. Continuing, then we were told that we need a broad popular newspaper, a sort of communist PM. We had similar expressions in the field of press circulation. First was the liquidation of the Browder brigades in New York. Then, that's so cringe. Then a folding up of the home delivery system. Then a theory that responsibility for the distribution of the Daily Worker and the Worker should not be placed on the membership in clubs. Let the newsstands and mail subs answer the problem. This sprang from the illusions we ourselves were creating. It resulted in negating the active role of communist members and clubs with reference to the press. It further resulted in practically wiping out our bundle sales. It made us exclusively dependent upon bourgeois forms of distribution, such as distribution agencies and the U.S. mail, to reach the masses with our message and leadership. Fourthly, the concept of membership in a communist organization. We developed concepts of communist membership which said that attending club meetings was not important, that collecting dues was a routine and thankless job, consequently let us have yearly dues, and that monthly club meetings were sufficient. Thus, during the past period, the CPA has not had organized contact with at least 50% of its membership. Add to this theories that we were harassing the members, that we were overburdening them and could not expect a new membership to come to meetings and fulfill so many activities. Comment, I've heard this from so many organizations today, and it is just not how you identify and strengthen active, dedicated members. Making revolution is not a hobby. Sorry. Anyway, all these concepts were essentially incorrect. I do not want to infer here that there are no new methods of work that can and should be adopted, or that there are no new things we must all learn. Of course there are, but new methods of work must not weaken the communist concept of membership in our organization, nor destroy that which distinguishes us from others. The central question is correct policy, but we need an organization with communist characteristics to carry out such policy. This demands that we combat all attempts to transform our clubs into Democratic or Republican Party types of clubs, or merely into neighborhood ping-pong and forum centers. Or we could add today video game groups, etc. We must quickly overcome all organizational looseness and reject all theories developed to justify it. Amen. Fifthly is the serious decline in dues payments. Years ago, dues payments averaged 85% for the entire country, with some districts reaching a higher level. However, during the last 6 months of 1944, dues in the CPA averaged 71%, and for the first 5 months of 1945, they have further declined to 58%. Even more alarming is the status for the first quarter of this year in such key industrial districts as Ohio, 44%, Michigan, 32%, Illinois, 45%, and Pittsburgh, 58%. Sixthly is the serious decline in the sale of theoretical literature by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. I only have figures for the country excluding New York, but these show that for the 6 years between 1938 to 43, we sold a yearly average of 34,000 copies of Marxist-Leninist classics. However, for 1944, this had declined to 19,000 copies, and this included 5,000 volumes of the Lenin Home Library. I do not have the figures for the New York district, but I'm told that the decline is proportionately the same. given such conditions, a critical situation was inevitable. And that is the end of the audiobook. So I think that in summary, we can say that Williamson, this was a much briefer piece than most of the others, but he took a different approach. It was less of a theoretically grounded approach. There were some mentions of theory, but he was really focusing more on the practical outcomes and impact of the, quote unquote policy change of basically liquidating the CPUSA and creating the CPA instead. The numbers were telling the story that it was not holding up. Not a successful move, in other words. I've already given criticisms of his somewhat brief, touching on some of the theoretical points, and I don't have a lot else to add. I don't think that we really heard enough from Williamson in this piece to say decisively, what his theoretical outlook is. It was kind of, again, brief passing mention and more focused on the numbers and outcomes. Maybe somebody listening will have something to add in the comment section as far as if you see something between the lines of Williamson's piece about where he might be coming from. But I think that this is, another entry in the Marxism-Leninism versus revisionism second phase of this playlist, where the party is going to be reconstituted, but again, it's by the same people who had basically liquidated it, and the question remains, does it have a solid enough theoretical basis amongst these leading members to actually reconstitute it and have it do something fundamentally different? Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comments area below, and we'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, this is a non-commercial channel. We don't do ads or sponsorships. Please head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as a few dollars a month or a one-time donation, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. They allow me to spend more time making content, planning content, doing background research, editing videos, etc. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and that helps to boost this content and channel in the algorithm wherever you're watching it, YouTube, Patreon, Spotify, Substack, or SoundCloud. And remember that we can agitate and educate online pretty easily. Organizing, the third part of that slogan, agitate, educate, organize, takes place in real life. So connect with your local left, network, meet people, and take what you've learned here and in your other Marxist studies into that fight, wherever the class struggle is happening around you, whether it's in your city or if you're in a more rural area in your county, state, region, or even if you join a national group. All right, thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.